Back on Sports Bet, Betting Inside today, Pauly and Teddy. AFC North preview that we did earlier. Steelers, the class of this division. Really like Baltimore a lot. Liked them last year. Nasty defense. Problem was the offense. We'll see how Flacco does this time around. And the Browns, I'll forget about it. And not a dangerous combo with Andy Dalton and Marvin Lewis. Marvin Lewis 0-7 career in the playoffs. Dalton 0-4. Also, Lewis 0-7 in the playoffs. Never scored more than 17 points in any of the games. Here's the AFC North. Baltimore Ravens, win total 9, under $1.30. Last year, 8-8 straight up, 7-9 ATS, 7-8-1 to the under. Weird season, 3-0 start, then 0-4, then 4-1, then 1-3 to close out December, and the back-to-back losses at the end. Remember, they're going to win the division if they tackle Antonio Brown on Christmas at the goal line because the clock would have ran out. But he gets in, they lose that game, and then the meaningless game to Cincinnati in Week 17. They were eliminated after they lost Week 16 in Pittsburgh. They played a tough schedule, though, Teddy. That was a nasty defense, and they lost some close games. They were right there against Dallas, that weird Monday night game against the Patriots, the Steeler game, as we mentioned, and the Giant game, too, was tough. There was a big PI call that went against them in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, the Raider game, they lost by a point. So, I mean, most of their losses came to playoff teams. They had the one loss to the Jets right before the bye that probably doomed them as much as anything else. Well, that and the inability to get Antonio Brown on the ground a season ago. It's a team that went through a lot of changes. Let's go through what happened last year. From a turnover standpoint, they had 28 takeaways. That was tied for number 4 in the NFL. 23 giveaways, so they had a +5 turnover margin. The problem wasn't there. The offense, basically everything was around the average. 5.2 yards per play, slightly below average. 4 yards per rush, slightly below average. 6.4 yards per pass. That's bottom 5 in the NFL. And 33 sacks allowed, that also right around. Actually slightly better than league average. So the biggest issue on offense, the inability to throw downfield. Defensively, the numbers were good. As they've been, 86.9 QB rating allowed, slightly better than average. 31 sacks, right around the league average. They were top 5 in the NFL against the rush, only 3.7 yards per rush allowed. So, the defense, even though it cost them in that Steelers game, it was really the offense that held them back a season ago. But both offense and defense have been revamped this past offseason.
And in the draft, they took nothing but defensive players, or at least early. Humphrey from Alabama. The kid from Michigan, and also Williams, a linebacker from Alabama as well. Now, what do they do on offense? Because Perriman, who they took in the first round, hasn't been able to get on the field. Steve Smith retires, and another big blow. Dennis Pitta was cut after he suffered what many think is a career-ending injury as he hurt his hip again.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have some issues at the wide receiver position. And let's not forget, Kamar Aiken left for the Colts. And when you look at the other receivers in this division, what the Steelers have and what the Bengals have, these are the teams that Cincinnati's got to battle to win this, the division. You got Antonio Brown and A.J. Green and Martavius Bryant and John Ross and Juju Smith-Schuster, and the Ravens are rolling out there with Rashad Perriman, who's been basically a non-factor since being their first-round pick, and an aging Mike Wallace, which is an issue when it comes to playmakers, and it may be even a bigger issue, Pauly, because they've got some offensive line concerns. Remember, they drafted Ronnie Stanley, number 6 overall last year, to be their left tackle, and then Rick Wagner left town for the payday in Detroit. They need tackle help again this season. They didn't get any in the draft or really in free agency.
I like their defense, though. I mean, again, they were outstanding last year and very good during stretches, especially at home.
Yeah, I mean, they have Brandon Williams is stud on the interior of the defensive line, but they traded Timmy Jernigan, who started 15 games for them a season ago. They cut Elvis Dumervil, and Terrell Suggs. He's 34. He's on the wrong side of 2 torn Achilles, and he's their pass rusher right now, their primary pass rusher. They did make a bunch of moves. The secondary is going to be better this year. There's no question. It was a spotty secondary at times last season. The Ravens' schemes have been good. But they signed cornerback Brandon Carr from Dallas. As you mentioned, they drafted Marlon Humphrey in the first round. And then the safety Tony Jefferson also came over in free agency from Arizona. So, along with Eric Weddle still back there, it's a pretty good-looking secondary, and a lot of the weaker links. Let's see, Ladarius Webb, Kendrick Lewis, Sharice Wright, bye-bye. Although Zach Orr retired, which left him with a little bit hole at linebacker as well.
Strength of schedule last year, league average again this year. The AFC North faces the AFC South and the NFC North. They catch a break there. The 2 extra games at Oakland and Miami at home. 3 division games the first 4 weeks, so they got to get off to a good start. After a trip to Lambeau November 19th, 4 of the last 6 at home. One of the road games is at Cleveland, so we've got to take advantage of that as well. They could maybe make some hay there. You know, Cincinnati at home, this is all late. Cincy at home, Indy at home, at Cleveland, Detroit, Houston at home. I mean, those are all winnable games too. But they have to keep Flacco healthy and help out that defense as well. What do you think? Early lean?
You know, I can see why there's been a little bit of under money. It's hard for me to picture this team as a 10-win squad. They look to me more like an 8 or 9 win type of team, which, you know, says that you bet under 9 when you have that number available.
Cincinnati Bengals, 8.5 wins, under -135. Last year, 6-9-1 straight up, 7-9 ATS, 10-6 to the under, 3-4 heading to the London game against Washington. Blew a late lead, ended up in a tie. 3-4-1 heading to the break, then lost 3 in a row after the bye. All hell broke loose. Not a pretty. They didn't end the season well as the wheels came off late, Teddy.
Well, it was actually their December wasn't bad. It was November. It was post-bye that everything fell apart. That 3-game skid. You know, they went at 3-4, and they had that Redskins game, and they had a decent schedule. They were favored in 2 of the 3 games they lost right after the bye. But the fact they didn't win any of those contests, you know, 3-7-1 heading into December, and the rest of the season is garbage time for a squad that, again, people forget how consistently good the Bengals were under Andy Dalton. They made the playoffs each of the first 5 years in the league. Last year, the first year that it was garbage time by December, and much of that was schedule. You know, a big reason why we didn't like Cincinnati last year was their schedule was brutal. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And they were riddled with injuries. The key guys, not the second-tier players, they lost a bunch of their stars for extended stretches last year that really cost them, and certainly in terms of their ability to run the offense that they were hoping to run.
Dangerous combination, Dalton and Lewis. Horrible. Never won a playoff game. Why is he still the coach? Mainstream stats, 20 takeaways, 17 giveaways, +3 turnover margin. Offense, 5.4 yards per play on offense. Average, 4 yards per rush. Below average, 7.5 yards per pass. That was 10th. 41 sacks allowed, near the bottom. Defense, 83.1 QB rating allowed. That was 5th. 33 sacks, league average, 4.4 yards per rush allowed, below average. I like Ross and love the Washington program, but that was taking them top 10. Jesus, calm down. Joe Mixon, a risky pick in the second round. I like the Willis pick out of Kansas State as well. Offensive line had a ton of issues, Teddy. What do you think of the O-line and the running game? They have weapons, though.
Well, that's just it. I mean, remember, prior to last year, one of the things we didn't like this team is they lost 2 huge weapons. There's a Marvin Jones and Mohamed Sanu, and they missed both guys last year. And then the running backs, you know, Giovanni Bernard was banged up, and, you know, it really hasn't panned out for them. They've spent a lot of draft capital on running backs, and it certainly wasn't an area of strength for them last year. Again, you say what you want about a guy's character off the field. Joe Mixon, as a talented back, I thought it was a steal at number 48. And John Ross, what's the guy got? A 4.22 40. You know, those type of weapons, when you think about Green on one side, Tyler Eifert, and then Mixon, and then Ross, you know, Andy Dalton's got some weapons to work with, but does he have an offensive line that can protect him? Again, they lost their 2 best offensive linemen in free agency, the left tackle Andrew Whitworth and the right guard Kevin Zeitler. And all of the, you know, they were planning on this. Back in 2005, 2015, their top 2 picks were both on the offensive line, you know, Abuchi and Fisher, and both those guys have basically stunk it up in the league. You know, Fisher couldn't beat out Eric Winston. Abuchi was pretty much a disaster at right tackle last season. And in the draft this year, the only lineman they picked was J.J. Dielman out of Utah, a 5th rounder, a development guy. So coming into the season, from a skill position standpoint, this team's way better than they were last year. From an offensive line standpoint, on paper, they're a heck of a lot worse.
Got to protect him. When he's pressured, his QBR is 9.9. The only passer over that time frame with a worse QBR under pressure is the Sanchez, minimum 200 attempts. His career high at QBR was 106.3. Last year, 91.8. QB rating, whatever. A 6-year start, only missed 3 games in his career. So they have the weapons on offense. Ross, Green, and Eifert could be a tough combination, not to mention Mixon and Hill running the ball as well. Let's talk about the SOS.
Yeah, sure. Big drop-off from last year in terms of toughness. Last year, their schedule was brutal. And it was brutal early. Remember that stretch? I believe it started week 3. They had Pittsburgh and Denver, and Miami and Dallas and New England. And back-to-back. They only won one of those games, and that sent them spiraling downward. They were in the top quartile of the NFL in toughness last year. This year, below average toughness, and from a strength of schedule standpoint, it is the single easiest schedule in the division. From that standpoint, Cincinnati has it a lot easier in 2017 than they did in 2016.
I'm looking at late November where they can make some noise. Cleveland at home, Pittsburgh at home is tough, then Chicago, Minnesota, Detroit, and Baltimore. That is doable if they get off to a good start.
Yeah, I mean, this Bengals team, we didn't like them at all last year. And I've got big concerns on the offensive line. This is a team I'm going to watch a lot in the preseason. I want to see how that OL looks. If it looks decent, if it looks like they can protect Andy Dalton, the Bengals will be a legitimate choice to go over the total this year, even though I cashed a ticket betting them under their season win total last year.
Today, the Cleveland Browns, win total 4.5. Under -130. Last year, 1-15 straight up, 3-12-1 ATS, 8-8 over/under. Mainstream stats, 13 takeaways. Only the Bears had fewer. 25 giveaways, -12 turnover margin. There's nothing to like here, Teddy. The offense, everything was terrible. They're lucky they won a game.
Yeah, no question. But it's the NFL. Teams find a way to win a game, or 2, or 3, or 4, despite being awful in many different categories. For Cleveland last year, being awful. I mean, they were awful in everything. But there was some stuff to like offensively, interestingly enough. Okay, the 5.1 yards per play, that's well below league average. The 6.5 yards per pass, that's the bottom quartile. The 66 sacks allowed, the worst in the NFL by far. The second worst team, LA, had 49 sacks allowed, which just shows how bad Cleveland was. But the one thing that stood out, one thing they did okay last year, 4.9 yards per rush. That was number 2 in the NFL. Only Buffalo was better. They were ahead of the Dallas Cowboys in yards per rush. Their bigger problem, in my mind, last year was the defense that, as you mentioned, only forced the 13 takeaways.
101.8 quarterback rating allowed. Second worst in the NFL behind the Lions. 26 sacks, 30th. Only the Lions and Raiders had fewer. And 4.6 yards per rush allowed, 4th worst. I think they had a good draft. Garrett, number 1. Peppers also in the first round. Njoku, the tight end out of Miami, first round. Kaiser, the quarterback out of Notre Dame, in the second round. I don't know what they're going to do at quarterback, but maybe, just maybe, Osweiler can have a decent season. There's no pressure on the guy now. He flamed out in Houston. I mean, no one expects him to do anything with the Browns.
I'm with you 100%. Look at the picture. I mean, Hugh Jackson last year, he was down on his knees begging for a quarterback over and over. You remember the injuries they had at quarterback. You remember the disaster the offensive line was. And, of course, the lack of skill position talent was disastrous. This year, I'm telling you, their quarterback situation is better. Okay, maybe Deshaun Kaiser is the QB of the future. Maybe he isn't. He brings them marginally closer to an answer at least. But I'm with you on Osweiler having nothing but upside with Cleveland. Number 1, Hugh Jackson's a bright offensive mind. Number 2, the markets aren't expecting anything out of Brock Osweiler. So if he's decent, all of a sudden there's a whole lot of value on Cleveland. Now, to say that this team is going to turn the corner at the QB position or find the answer for the future or be better than average at QB, I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is that the Browns are likely to have a better QB situation this year than last and could get decent QB play, and that might go a long way towards bringing them back to respectability.
They upgraded the offensive line. They did a good job there. Greg Williams, the new defensive coordinator. Well, I mean, what is it? 3-4, 4-3, 3-4. What are they doing now on defense?
Yeah, they're switching back to a 3-4 as they've done. But I got to talk about the offensive line because an upgrade is not a strong enough statement. This offensive line was a freaking disaster last year. So they signed Kevin Zeitler. They signed him away from the rival in Cincinnati. He's one of the best guards in football. They got the future Hall of Famer at left tackle in Joe Thomas. They locked up the one good interior lineman they have, Joel Pitonio, to an extension, and they signed J.C. Treader from Green Bay. This has the makings of a decent to above average offensive line. I think there's real hope in that regard for the Cleveland Browns. When it comes to the other end of the equation, on the defensive side, I'm not a big fan of Greg Williams, and I haven't been, but they have a lot of building blocks. You look at Jamie Collins and Danny Shelton and Joe Hayden, all guys who should be fitting into the latest defensive change. And as you mentioned, they've been switching from 3-4 to 4-3 and back again. In my mind, that's a bigger issue in the media than it is on the field. They're playing hybrid styles right now, and I expect to see a lot of that. But, of course, Williams as a defense coordinator has been largely discredited over the course of his failed defenses in many different stops in recent years. I don't know how well he's going to fit in Cleveland this season.
What do you have on the schedule? And the NFL said, beat it, get out of here. They don't have one national TV game.
No, they sure didn't. I mean, last year's schedule was brutal. It was top 5 in the NFL for toughness. This year, it's still the toughest schedule in the division, obviously, because they don't get to play themselves, but it's notably easier than it was last year. They do lose a home game to play the Vikings in London. That's never a good thing. Now, if you remember, this is not a team, and as you mentioned, they don't play anything in terms of night. What do they have? I think they have one 4 o'clock game in L.A. They don't even get any late afternoon games. It's all 1 o'clock starts for the Browns, with the exception of that one game in London, which is going to be an early, 9:30 a.m. kickoff in Cleveland.
Well, I talked to a lot of professional bettors who kind of like this over, but I can't get there. You're talking about a big jump from 1 win to 5. What do you think?
I think they're very live. I could only bet Cleveland over. And if you remember, the very first win total, when the lines first came out, we talked about it on the show, and we used it as a play of the day, and my line was, this number's not going to be there tomorrow. That was Cleveland over 4, and I knew that number wouldn't last, and it didn't. I would still bet them over 4.5 right now before I bet them under 4.5. But, of course, we can't use that as a play of the day now because you already used over 4 for a play of the day, which was a much better bet, which leaves us with something else.
The Pittsburgh Steelers, win total 10.5, over -120. Last year, 11-5 straight up, 9-6-1 ATS, 10-6 to the under. Mainstream stats, 23 takeaways, 18 giveaways, +5 turnover margin. The offense, 5.8 yards per play on offense. 4.3 yards per rush, that was average. So was 7.3 yards per pass. 21 sacks allowed, second best in the NFL. Only the Raiders had fewer. They are stacked on offense, Teddy.
They certainly are. But when we look at the numbers from last year, they don't blow you away offensively. Yes, they were in the top quartile overall in yards per play on offense, but average yards per rush, average yards per pass. We remember 2 years ago how explosive this offense was. Last year, still a good offense, but not with that same big playability that we saw 2 years ago. And, of course, defensively, last year this team was nothing but average. 87.3 QB rating allowed. That was right near the league average. 38 sacks was good. That was in the top 10, but not one of the true elite pass rushing teams. 4.3 yards per rush allowed. That was slightly below the league average. Defensively, let's call them what they were, mediocre in 2016.
Draft, I take T.J. Watt out of Wisconsin in the first round. Juju Smith-Schuster out of USC. Just what they need, another wide receiver, right? As they get Bryant back off the suspension as well. And they took Connor, the running back from Pittsburgh, in the third round. Harrison led the Steelers amazingly with 5 sacks at the age of 38. He's back for another season, but they need help on that defense. So you get Bryant, Coates, Schuster to go along with Brown, and Rodgers. Roethlisberger's got all these guys to throw to.
Yeah, he sure does. And let's not forget, there's Eli Rogers, there's Justin Hunter, there's Le'Veon Bell, who's as good as any pass-catching back in the NFL. And I like the addition of James Conner from Pittsburgh, a tough between-the-tackles runner, as well as a couple of key guys on defense. You talked about Watt as the number 1 pick. Cameron Sutton, the cornerback out of Tennessee, he's got the potential to get a fair bit of playing time as a rookie. And, of course, let's not even worry too much about the defense just yet. Let's talk about this offense. an offense that didn't have all their big play weapons last year. Well, Big Ben's coming back, and basically, when you're talking about big play weapons and quick strike guys, the Steelers are exceptional in that regard, and they're also exceptional when it comes to offensive line continuity, Pauly. All 5 starting linemen have been with the Steelers for at least the last 4 seasons, and Pittsburgh, down the stretch last year, that offensive line was playing as well as any in the NFL. I ranked them as a top 5 offensive line going into the season. So when you have the weapons, the quarterback, and the offensive line, there's no excuse for this offense not to be scoring touchdowns in bunches, and certainly not settling for field goals, as they had a problem with at times last year as well.
They got to stay healthy, and guys can't get suspended. Certainly, they are a scary offense. Is this the second best team in the AFC?
On paper, you have to rank Pittsburgh as number 2 in the AFC because of their ability to strike quickly, because of the fact they've got a Super Bowl winning quarterback, guy with a couple of rings on his fingers in Big Ben, and because, frankly, the defense that was pretty good last year might be, or the defense was mediocre last year, might be pretty good this year. And that would certainly give the Steelers something of an edge over anyone else in the AFC other than New England.
What do you have on the schedule?
Well, I mean, the AFC North faces the NFC North and the AFC South. Their 2 extra games are both tough, at KC at Arrowhead and then home to the Patriots. Last year, schedule slightly tougher than average. This year, pretty comparable. Right around the league average, a little bit tougher, but nothing to freak out about. Of course, it helps when you play the Browns and their 4.5 win total twice a year. And of course, the TV networks, they're very interested in Pittsburgh this season because 6 of their last 7 games are either late games or prime time game. And the only exception is a 1 p.m. local start game against the Browns in Week 17, a game that Pittsburgh hopes to be resting starters. And they have a 4-game stretch where they play Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night, and Sunday night again over a 4-week span. So certainly the TV networks, they have a vested interest in the Steelers' success because that late season stretch comes from, Week 11 through Week 16, where it's all late night or primetime games.
All right, to the class of that division, what do you want to do? 10.5, gun to your head.
I'm not playing the Steelers over. I'm not playing their under. This, to me, is a very clear pass, I should say, for a team that looks like they have a lot of talented pieces on offense on paper. I got questions about Pittsburgh. I'm not looking at them as an 11-win team, and they are a team that has nothing to prove in the regular season, but they're certainly not a team I'm looking to stand in front of. So Pittsburgh, for me, a clear pass. I'm not going to get involved with the team.
All right, that'll do it. That's our AFC North preview. Obviously not a fan of Dalton and Lewis. A lot of help in Cleveland. They'll be lucky to win 4 games, 5 games, although Teddy likes them over 4. And Steelers, the class of that division. Maybe Baltimore can grab a wild card spot. We'll see you next time on SportsBit, Betting Insight today on SBRPicks.com.